I learned that finding your niche isn't really all that complicated. You ask who's drawn to you, who have you made the greatest impact with, who have you worked with? And when I did, I found a couple of things to be true.
All right, Dan, I really want to thank you for joining us today here on the Industry Leaders. For people who don't know about Dan McPherson's work, Dan is an international speaker, business and personal development coach, and he's also the founder and CEO of a company called Leaders Must Lead. Dan, it's great to have you here. Before we get going, it would be great if you wanted to tell people a little bit about what it is you and your business do and the kind of clients that you serve.
Thank you so much, Rob. I'm super excited to be here. I love any conversation about leadership and all of these things that we can do in the world to shine the light that allows us to help more people. So for me, I work primarily with entrepreneurs and creatives, and that's capital C creatives. So think like authors and gamers and musicians and things like that. I also work a lot with many different women and minorities. And I do this because really look for the voices that maybe haven't been heard. I look for those people who maybe have felt unseen and unheard over the years. And a lot of what I do, the work that I find is helping to aim at the people who are looking for two very specific things: how to find their calm and how to get their next steps. And with Leaders Must Lead, whether I'm speaking or whether I'm coaching, that's a lot of it. And I think that's a pretty visceral need that most of us have, right? Like, how do I feel calm? How do I find that? And where do I go from here?
Yeah, it's interesting that you focus on those markets as well, because those are generally groups that need representation. It's difficult for me to say this as as a white male, but I guess those are the groups that probably are more reticent to speak out sometimes for a variety of different reasons. So I feel like your work is very important. But how do you identify the people in those groups that you feel that can lead or would be in need of what you're doing in terms of leadership skills?
It's interesting because a lot of the initial work that I did was aimed at sort of where I came from. It was aimed at the corporate world. It was aimed at unintentionally, probably middle-aged white men, right? Like you said, that's a difficult thing for me. And as I began to ask the right questions, I began to ask, well, who do I serve? Well, how do I figure that out? And I started to go down the niching path, if you will. I learned that finding your niche isn't really all that complicated. You ask who's drawn to you, who have you made the greatest impact with, who have you worked with? And when I did, I found a couple of things to be true. One is that I found the vast majority of my clients had fallen into three categories. They had fallen into women, creatives, and people in the LGBTQ community. And then I said, wait a minute, why is that? Because I'm none of the three. And so that was so strange to me. And I realized it was for two reasons. One is because those people go through life, and in many cases, far from all, of course, but in many cases, they do feel unseen and unheard. And that was how I felt as a kid. I grew up hidden from my father for 6 years, living in poverty, exposed to violence and abuse and all sorts of different crazy things, to the point to where I felt completely unseen and unheard enough to survive my first suicide attempt at 16 and make the changes in my life, or begin making the changes in my life that led me to where I am now. So they were me. And that's almost always true, I find, when you discover your niche. The second understanding came later, which was that I speak in a voice that connects with them, which I found because they're drawn to me. I don't often have to go and seek them. They seem to show up in my space and say, hey, I heard what you said. That connects. I have learned in a masculine voice world, this isn't about masculine, feminine, gender so much as the voice that we speak with or that we hear, but I act as a translator because I speak with a strong feminine energy as well. And I didn't know that or have any idea what that meant until maybe 2 years ago.
So, I mean, it sounds like when they find you, I mean, they're finding you through social channels or public speaking or.
Yeah, public speaking when I'll show up and share also from our podcast, our Dreams Are Real podcast. One of the things that we do there, the primary purpose of that is to show that dreams are real, and we do it by telling deep stories. So beginning with, what were your first memories as a child? What were your dreams when you were a little kid? What are they now? Which sadly is often what dreams now, because they've gotten crushed. But as they get uncovered, where do people go? And that storytelling, especially since 60% of my guests, maybe 65, have been women, speaks to a lot of people as they hear it and go, wait a minute, I want to know, more about that. I want to find out more about that. And certainly social channels, although I am maddeningly inconsistent on my social channels and working to improve that.
You and me both. Uh, when we're talking about kind of the sphere of leadership and particularly with the people that you work with, what do you see as the core requirements for a successful leader now? You know, I feel like we had a very different world 20, 30 years ago, and a different set of requirements perhaps. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I've grown up in leadership over the last way too many years, because I'm not super young anymore, right? I've spent 30 plus years as a formal leader. And I say that because I think one of the most important understandings we can have isn't that we get into leadership. It's that every one of us is a leader. The only choice is whether we're good at it. The same thing that every one of us is a salesperson. The only choice is whether we're good at it. And once we recognize that, now it's about, do we make that choice? And making a choice to be a good leader societally appears very different than it did 20 years ago, as I was learning the beginnings of leadership, but practically isn't actually that different. The foundation of leadership is people. My number one core belief in the world is that people matter most and relationships are everything. And I have gone from always believing that at my core, but having no idea how to show it, and letting my insecurity be covered with ego. That's why my book is titled what it is, The Unintentional Asshole. My journey from devastation to dreams, because that was me for 20 years. But now it is a win if you not only believe that the relationships are everything, but you can demonstrate that. Leadership is about people. That's why people quit people. They don't quit jobs. They don't quit companies.
I mean, in that respect, if leadership is about people and the way you deal with them, what advice would you have for somebody that would identify themselves as, say, quite introverted or is not a, inverted commas, people person?
That's a great question. And a lot of the clients that I work with are actually quite introverted. So not only great, but timely question. I think that there's a misconception that caring about people and being about people and relationships mean that you have to be extroverted. These are two completely different things. Also, no, and I'll say for two reasons. One, introverted doesn't mean that you don't have relationships. Introverted doesn't mean that you don't connect, that you don't care about people, that you don't show that care about people. It in many cases means that you have a smaller circle, or that relationships can be a little bit more draining to you, or you might need a recovery time. But speak to any introvert and ask them a question about their passion. And they all have a passion. My wife, who's one of the most introverted people I know, is passionate about knitting. And you may not know her from the world, but you ask her a question about knitting, and an hour later, when you're done with that conversation, you will have learned a ton and have become fast friends. I find that as those leaders who are more introverted in nature can find these smaller connections, can say, I may care about a smaller group of people. Remember that leadership in a formal sense in the corporate world is typically 4 to 8 direct reports. It's not 40 to 80. It's not 50 to 1,000. It's 4 to 8. And for an introvert, typically that can work very well.
Yeah, I never thought about it like that, actually. I think when sometimes, even now, as the owner of a media company that focuses on leadership, you still it's easy to fall into the trap of considering leadership as this thing where you lead huge teams or you lead huge corporations. It's not that, right? Like you said, it's the 4 to 8 people. It's generally your team.
It is. And the second note that I would make with it is something that we miss even more so. The number one hardest person to lead, but the most important person to lead is ourselves. If you're not around anybody else in the world, you are still a leader. Now, there's an argument that leadership is influence, and generally I would agree with that. But the first person to lead is ourselves. I believe leadership comes in 4 pillars. The first is personal growth, because the hardest person to lead is ourselves. The second is attitude, because now once I lead myself, it's how do I view the world. The third is connection. Once I view the world, it's how do I connect with the world. And then finally, the fourth pillar is team. How do I lead other people? And when we look at leadership in that light, we recognize that being a good leader is the result of doing the rest of the work. And that means introvert, extrovert, blue, doesn't matter. Whoever you are, you do those things and you will find a flowering leadership. And I wish I had recognized those things when I was younger, because I looked at leadership first through ego because I was so insecure, but second through ego because I wanted to lead so many people. Like that was, I wanted the status. And now I realize that all of that is really BS. And if I just focus on helping people and I focus on doing everything I can to help them win, the rest will take care of itself. In fact, and it's the last note I'll make on that, when I take over a team, which I haven't done in quite a while, I've built a team with my company, but I haven't taken over a team because I haven't been in the corporate world for a number of years. When I did, I would stand in front of them and I would hold up this job description, which was invariably 3 or 4 pages long. And I would say, I would ask them, what is my job? And they would point to that. And I would say, no, my job is one sentence. It's to do everything I can to help you win. The rest will take care of itself.
There are very few bosses I've worked for in the past that have done something like that, and it sticks with you. So I imagine all of those people have probably carried that same thing through now into their own careers. Hopefully, anyway.
I truly hope so. And I know that the clients that I work with today, from a coaching and consulting perspective, that they carry that with them and they embody that. It's one of the things I love about the people that I work with is that they're living as people-focused, heart-centered leaders. And I think it's worth making another note here. Coming from the corporate world that I did in the past, it is easy to hear that and go, yeah, but I'm not going to be soft and get run over and trampled and completely taken care of. And I will just unequivocally state that being people centered and heart focused doesn't mean being a soft ball of mush that gets crushed by everything. Quite the opposite. It actually shows a resilience, a strength, and a clarity of focus. Because if you don't lead with vision and clarity and focus, then you will lose. So there's not a weak softness in that. There is a strong flexibility in that.
I love that. I mean, sticking on the focus of leaders within corporations, I'm interested to hear if you have ever worked for what you might consider a bad leader or a poor leader in the past, and if you have, knowing what you know now, if you could go back and in your current form and retrain them or help them to get better, like how would you do that? What pointers would you give those people?
Well, I think like most people who are probably listening to this, yes, I have worked for people that I would consider bad leaders. Worse than that, I have been a bad leader. I spent a lot of years as someone that I wouldn't want to work for. And not because I didn't have a good heart, not because I didn't have the desire to do well, not because I didn't care about people, but because I had no idea how to express that, how to connect those dots. And I became initially, I would say, what I'm a manager rather than a leader, meaning I focused upon the tasks instead of the people. But if you focus upon the people who complete the tasks still get done, but the result is completely different and the buy-in is completely different. And so my first conversation is almost exclusively to create that inversion. The second is to truly empower, and strengthen your team. And the third is to communicate with your team. Truly empowering and strengthening your team isn't just saying, here's some responsibilities on a job list, go do it. It involves legitimate delegation. It involves follow up and support. It involves not jumping in and fixing everything for them. It involves giving them real authority to go along with real responsibility, and so much more that I could riff on, I'm sure. Communication is crucial and is maybe the biggest missing link for almost every leader that I encounter, because they think they're over communicating and they're not communicating enough, or they're not communicating in a way that connects. It's important to remember for communication that it doesn't actually occur unless the message is received. I can share something with you, but if you don't receive the message, I didn't communicate with you.
Yeah, I think that's such a vital point. I think you dealt with that question beautifully. You left out any trace of old leaders and talked about yourself, which is smart. I, I think what I'd like to ask now, I mean, for people perhaps like you in the past who may have worked for a bad leader, or what might be considered a poor leader in comparison to someone who that you're inspired by, do you have any advice for people who are in that position now, who are working for people who perhaps they don't respect as a leader, or perhaps they wish they were working for somebody else, but that's not an option right now? What advice would you give those people?
Yeah, and I've been in that space, and I always will point to myself in my own leadership journey, because I've had so much to learn and I've made enough mistakes to mine as long as we possibly can. But the situation you describe is a painful one. It's a difficult one. And in my mind, first, I'll point to another resource of someone who discusses this very, very well, and who is one of the people that I follow and connect with, Jocko Willink. He discusses working for the situation of working for leaders that you don't get along with and can't get out of extremely well. And not that I'm saying, hey, look, I don't have good thoughts on that. I think I do, but some of them are gained from there, and it's a great resource. For me, when I've been trapped in that situation, I've found that I really made a couple of mistakes, and they're the ones that I would point others away from. The first is, it becomes about ego, right? When we decide we don't like somebody, probably 3/4 of it is ego being the biggest impediment to our success. I don't like what they said to me, or how they treated me, or what I didn't get what I deserved or what I wanted, or I didn't get it as fast as I wanted. I didn't get the promotion I wanted, whatever that may be. And that is a lesson in ownership and humility, rather than necessarily being all about the other person. Remember, any conflict we have, we can influence them, but we can't change them. But we have 100% ownership of our own reactions and 100% control of our own reaction. So that's the first piece that I would give. The second I would say is, if it is truly bad, and I have unfortunately been in a couple of situations that were truly bad, that were saying, we will make this unethical decision, we will do this thing that goes against the fiber of your being, we are going to effectively force you to work 90 hours a week and they can't force me to be unhappy, because they don't determine my happiness, but they can create an unpleasant situation. The lesson I take from that is, if you think you can't leave, you're almost certainly wrong. Whether you choose to find another spot, whether you choose to create a different spot, whether you choose to become an entrepreneur, you can. Now, if you're in the military or somewhere like that, there are some other difficulties to navigate there, and leading from the inside will be the third point that I will give. But I wanted to mention that there's more freedom than you think. I've had places I thought I couldn't leave, or thought I couldn't afford to leave, particularly that last one. I thought I couldn't afford to leave. And I will recognize later that the damage that I was doing to myself and my body and my life and my mind was worth so much more than any dollars. Even if I had to go and eat rice and beans, or struggle immensely for several months, it would have been worth it. And the proof in that is, when you leave somewhere, about 3 weeks later, it usually takes about 3 weeks, you'll look back and go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how bad it was. And imagine it was already bad enough that you were desperate to leave, and you leave and realize it was 3 or 4 times worse, because we can rationalize anything. So I would encourage people to step out before they maybe even feel that they are quite ready in those cases, so that they don't do long-term damage. The last point is what I mentioned before, which is to say, lead from the inside. Take that boss that you don't understand, that you don't like, that you don't get along with, that's creating a tough situation. Learn what they want and help them get it. If you learn what they want and help them get it, you will likely change your situation. There's no guarantee, but at least you're going to mitigate some circumstances. And as always, don't do anything that's immoral, unethical, or illegal, of course.
I love that last point, because for me, I think that might be one of the most important points of getting through a situation like that, because it helps you to empathize with the other person, and it almost becomes a negotiation. I mean, that's negotiation 101, is to understand what the other side wants. And if you're so entrenched that you see this boss or this leader as an enemy, or as someone that you perhaps don't want to follow, then you need to someone needs to give, and you need to go to the other side. So I really like that advice.
Yeah, I think it's pretty crucial. And I wish earlier in my career I'd done a better job of asking questions. I think the single number one skill that we can develop is to be more curious, to
Mhm.
ask more and better questions. And oftentimes we make judgments about people based upon something, going back to my first point, based upon ego, usually. And once we've made that, we color in the picture, even though the other person didn't necessarily do that. So asking questions, having a conversation, finding out what someone else wants, figuring out what is a good solution rather than being tied to the negativity, can be very important, in particular because between levels, almost always there's misunderstanding. And the example I would use to look at that is when I would get promoted. I remember thinking, or when anybody else that I've promoted got promoted, I would hear the same thing, is that you look at your boss and you're like, oh, they've got it easy, and they don't have that much to do, and man, their life is so much better. And then you get promoted and you're like, oh my gosh, this job is hard. There's so much more to it than I ever saw. And beginning with that understanding, it's a little bit like a couple's relationship. If you assume the best of somebody instead of assuming the worst, you'll end up in a better place.
I love it. Moving on to something a little more positive than bad leadership. uh, what advice would you give to people that are either aspiring, they don't necessarily have to be young, but I think hungry, ambitious people within an organization that want to move up to a different leadership position, or people that are thinking about starting a business, and are not quite sure whether they're up to the task of either leading themselves or leading a team? What key advice would you give to people in those kind of situations to get them started?
Would give each of them a slightly different piece of advice. The one who is looking to move forward in leadership, and I've given this advice many times. I didn't give it as clearly as I will now, unfortunately, throughout my career. I was trying to, but now I've got it. And that is, move in eagerness rather than impatience. Eagerness is about upward and outward. Eagerness is about earning and learning. Eagerness is about gaining from the journey rather than having to be at the destination. Whereas impatience, where most of us get stuck, where I spent many years stuck, impatience is about ego. It's down and in. Eagerness, or impatience rather, is about the destination and I have to get there now. It's about I deserve and entitlement and all of that. If you can flip your switch from impatience to eagerness, you'll be amazed at how much further you go, how much faster you go. It blows me away because it changes you to humility, focusing on other people and being in the journey and earning it. So that for those who are trying to take that step forward in their career, I think that the reason I would give a different answer, that's important as well, but the reason I would give a different answer for those who are questioning whether they are stepping out on their own is because I think back to myself as I was in the corporate world for 20 plus years and asking, oh my gosh, can I step out on my own? I always thought I was going to be a number two. I never really thought, oh, I'm an entrepreneur. And there's a lot of fear. And I actually stepped off the cliff by saying no to my third promotion in 5 years, walking away from more money than I ever thought that I would make in my life and going to zero with no other money in the house. So I get that fear pretty viscerally. And my answer to you would be do it. Would be that if you are passionate about it, if you have this thing that you say I can't not do it. People ask, Dan, when should I write a book? When you can't not do it. When should I start a podcast? When you can't not do it. When your idea gets to that spot where you feel like you can't not do it, there's very little to lose. You may lose a couple months of progress. You may have a risk of a few months of what you could have done of opportunity cost, but the loss that you get if you don't do it is far more than just the business. It's the loss of regret. Interview people at the end of their life, and they will almost invariably tell you that they regret the things they didn't do. They do not regret the things they did. And you are absolutely good enough, because no matter where you are, no matter where you're from, no matter what you've done or what you've been through, there's always light through the darkness. Even if you encounter darkness, there will always be light. And your dream is real if you do the work to make it real. Now, one caveat, be smart about it. like make choices to plan, as opposed to going on an emotional whim and just being like, woohoo, I jumped out of a plane. Wait, where's my parachute?
I like it. I like it. And I think it leads nicely on to the next question that I have for you. You did an interview with us recently, where you said that the best advice that you'd ever received was that, I'm quoting, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you choose to respond. I think we've all heard quotes like that in the past, and at some point or another, they're useful. But I think my question to you is, how would you recommend somebody going through a bad time can use that advice? Because it's often difficult to see, how can I react in a positive situation? How would you recommend somebody who's going through a particularly bad moment can use that advice still?
Well, to share that, if I can, I'd like to share an example from me going through a bad moment using that advice. And it is the best advice that I've occurred. There's a corollary to it that'll come up in a moment. About 18 months ago, I guess maybe it's not quite that long, maybe about 16 months ago, I had my first heart attack, and I'm 47 years old. It was a pretty darn scary thing. And as it turns out, I had it within a week and a half of the same age my mother was when she passed away, of the exact same genetic defect in her heart that we discovered. And it was a scary, pretty bad time, as you can imagine, as I'm laying there in the middle of COVID alone in the hospital having a heart attack, and the one that they told me that 60% of people didn't live from. And in that moment, with the cold of the operating room table on my back and talking to them, I was, for maybe the first time in my life, in a truly bad situation. I mean, I'd been in a lot of bad situations, unfortunately, but for the first time, I felt gratitude. And at first I was like, wait a minute, why am I just feeling? No, I felt fear. Like, fear was real. Don't want to die. Not a good thing. But I felt gratitude, and I looked at it, and I recognized that I truly connected with this understanding that no matter what's going on, objectively, two things are true. One is that objectively, 90% of the things in my life, even in that moment, were good. My son is incredible. I have family and friends who care all over the world. I was getting hundreds of responses from social media because I like to post my story, because I'll tell my story no matter what. I had a place to live. I had I had a car. I had food. I had all of these things. And objectively, there were a couple of things, big though they may be, that were not right. And that objectivity can really, really help. The second was that laying there, I got it. I said, I can either respond by being caught in the moment and saying, I'm going to die, in which case, by the way, I probably will. Or I can be caught in the moment by saying, all right, I'm going to do the things that I can do. I am going to respond. I am going to choose to have a reaction that is different. I am going to listen to the doctors instead of being stubborn. I'm going to hear what they're saying. I'm going to give them the feedback that they need. I am going to send positive vibes into the world. I am going to, when I get out of here, because at that point it became obvious that I was thankfully going to get out of there. I'm going to make some changes to my life. I'm going to do the things that I need to do. And that's all about response. And had I responded in the negativity, I would have been lost to maybe the depression that had caught me through different parts of my life. I would have been lost to my actual life. And it was just such clarity that I could have gratitude for the opportunity to react. And I think that that's when it becomes most clear, is when you're faced with such an incredibly direct choice that I can respond or not. Now, from a practical standpoint, I think that a tip that I give to everybody is take a breath. Now, for me, in that moment, that was a little difficult, but in most people's case, I think recognizing, much like I did when I was out selling, that we have an emotional instant reaction to almost everything, and getting past that before we make a response is really important. So if I can, just a quick story, when I would go out selling, I was straight commission sales much in my earlier days. And I did very, very well at it. But initially, I would go out, I would do this hour and a half presentation. And in my mind, I'm like, I killed it, I nailed it, and straight commission. So if I don't sell, I don't eat. I'd get to the end, I'd look across the table and I'd say, oh, that'll be 87.63. And we can take care of that one or two ways: 25% down, the balance on your satisfactory completion. Would you prefer to pay cash or finance? And they would look at me and say, well, I want to think about it. And I'd like lean over the table and be like, what do you want to think about? Because my emotional reaction was, I need the sale. And what I learned is that if I inserted an action into this process that forced me to take a breath, in my case, it was cross my legs, sit back, and take one breath. So if you cross your leg and sit back, you almost have to take a breath, that my brain would engage and I would be objective and I could say, oh, I can certainly appreciate that. And I could calmly have a conversation that was still about helping them. In our life, we do the same thing. We have this immediate, visceral, emotional reaction that a lot of times gets us into trouble. But if we can pause and take a breath and respond instead of react, we will see that 10%. We will see that we don't want to go to Vegas and roll our dice on the 10% that is what happened, but we'd rather bet on the 90% that is our ability to respond in a positive way.
I think that's a beautiful way to wrap things up. And before we do, I just want to ask, just in terms of what you have planned for sort of the next 6 to 12 months for yourself and also for Leaders Must Lead, if you can tell us a little bit about what the future looks like for you, that'd be great.
Thank you. We're continuing with the Dreams Are Real podcast. I encourage everyone to check that out. We tell these incredible stories, and I love being able to shine the light in the world there. I will be doing some speaking, but the things that I'm super excited about are Foundations of Success online learning platform, where we take and recognize that most people are looking out there and saying, I want a solution. And they look for this beautiful roof that goes on a house. The problem is, if you put a beautiful roof on walls made of tissue paper, it just falls down. My job, I look at it as to help build those walls, whether it is through strategy, but also through understandings of leadership, sales, communication, time effectiveness, all of those. And we provide those tools through that platform. And we'll be building that out. It's really in its newer stages, and it has a ton of training, 50 plus hours already, but we'll be building that out in a powerful way. I will be adding to our coaching clients and also God willing, speaking all over the world again. I look forward to the doors opening. So if anyone knows any speaking opportunities, feel free to reach out.
Well, you heard it here first. I'm sure we'll be in touch with you if that comes up. That's fantastic. Dan, that's brilliant. Thanks so much for taking the time with us today.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate being here. I appreciate the work you're doing in the world.